Craftsmanship is one of those issues where, in order to fully appreciate the dinner plate, you have to hear about the hunt. So, we're going to look backwards in order to push forward. So, strap in. Here we go. We have to think back to a time where the activity was seeing designers, choreographers experiment with deconstruct and reconstruct approach to the sharing of phrases between performers and an eventual pointillist approach with individuals. One example might be when groups of performers that initiated the phrase would then trade off to other performers to ultimately finish the phrase, creating a sophisticated approach to the relationships of performers and the sharing and trading of focus within singular events. The use of individual choreographic entrances and exits, as well as spatial departures and arrivals, became key to the success and subtle nature of this designed effect. In the same period, many borrowed from this concept in order to let individuals pull away from the herd, to demonstrate a special skill, or to ultimately create a singular focus to cover transitions and shifts of equipment to allow for perhaps a surprise shift in color or volume. Then we saw new designers, with a shortage of understanding perhaps, borrow from this approach to pull people at random out of things and move in perhaps a pedestrian way into a focus without any choreographic connection into the next event. Most of the time, they were completely untethered from the obligation to create the context and the settings that had given purpose to this device as a sophisticated approach. These clunky hacks became so widespread that they were eventually given license to permeate all classes and just by their sheer volume were mistakenly assumed to be viable approaches. This was the period that gave rise to what was called random acts of color guard. What was missing was the detailed eye of the visionary that knew how and why to use the device and to what event it might lead the audience to. The next devolving step came when choreographers started to ignore the builds into and out of events, the setups of equipment phrases, as well as the trade offs between elements. One of the carryovers we still see from this period is that when a performer is going into an individual focus and it's time to toss, function often guides the counts leading into the event, with many simply changing hands to get set, then waiting it flat until the eventual dip, toss, and hope for the best outcome. The steering committee's response during these years was to introduce crafting of phrase to the sheets and judge awareness. Like so many things, craftsmanship is obvious in its absence, but in the spectrum of to what degree, absence only accounts for half of the possibilities. In a system that rewards achievement, recognizing a crafted approach is important in recognizing the efforts as assets. Craftsmanship is seen in the connections, the attention to detail, the simple act of attending to things. Like downstairs observations of technique, we can see how much information the performers are given by the staff. Craftsmanship can be considered similarly, but with craftsmanship, it's not the technical staff dropping the ball, it's typically the visionary, the designer, the choreographer. Craftsmanship is a window into the sensibilities of the creative team as seen through their performers. Downstairs, we know examples of the lapse of care when we see a phrase interrupted by a functional shortest distance to a dip, or when effort is put into the care and invention when moving into the ground, but coming out of the ground has the function of a toddler being called. One of our steering committee members talks frequently about the connective tissue in the choreography. This doesn't mean that every count is a primary focus and a feature, but it means a greater responsibility than simply off and on. IA has to be careful not to discuss the choreography in terms of aesthetics of the choice. There is a skill in these connections, in staying engaged, in the active participation over time. This is different than phrase length. There's also an agreement with committee members that downstairs already seems to be doing the job in large percentages, and one of them has actually expressed the fear that our addressing this issue now may shift their focus. Understand the difference between the choreographic choice as skill and the choreographic choice as aesthetic. GE has had the concept of crafting for a while now. It's important to acknowledge when we see something that is well crafted and find value in it when we see it. Expand the awareness to all elements and find the achievements. With the expansion of the caption over the last years, design may have the largest gap to fill. If all equipment starts with the body, then all effects starts with design. Crafting is key to the plan and the manifestation of effect. Design accounts for relationships of all observable elements over time. We have the license to say it when we see it and distinguish the spectrum between lack of attention and the ultimately well crafted. Go to the back of the sheet and you will find that this describes our range of to what degree. The steering committee also spoke about the artisan aspects of crafting. This is one of a kind, customized attention afforded to each individual group as opposed to a one size fits all approach. We've struggled with this recently as we reconcile this with the current period of consultant culture that oftentimes carries a built in disconnect between the creative influence of the consultant and the performers themselves. This programmed but unintentional disconnect can be seen in many aspects of each sheet. In the same way that seeing a musical approach is often, but not always, an indicator of a wider range of dynamic efforts of space time, weight, and flow, when you see a customized approach that is implied in this artisanal approach, which can be motivated by premise, setting, character, group identity, etc., you are more likely to see a greater sense of craftsmanship. The efforts here are typically not the shortest distance to the finish line, so they require an investment beyond what is typical. This is not an always statement, but frequently. I would suggest that the customization aspect of craftsmanship is available in all classes to different degrees, and once recognized, should be rewarded in all classes. In the world classes, however, this sense of awareness, detail, and identity should be expected. It is this class that determines what the language of color guard can do. When in critique with instructors, it might be helpful to understand process and its impact of how and when the details of craftsmanship appear in their process. For groups that work linearly, they typically don't move on until what they have is exactly as they like it. Other groups may work more organically, skipping around to workshopped events and reverse engineering the connections as an eventuality. Linear groups will likely be able to be appreciated earlier in the season, and those that have a crafted awareness will demonstrate that early. Those that work more organically may take most of the year to build their continuum, including the crafted connections. When you see it, say it, reward it, knowing that each group will progress at different rates and that you will be open to seeing it differently as you reach the end and more groups ultimately reach their fulfilled potential of a well crafted show. How they get there is none of our business. It's that they get there that's important, both immediate and eventual. Do you remember the era of random acts of color guard? Considering your caption, can you name an example of a carryover or holdover from that era that we still see today? In the absence of craftsmanship, function seems to be the singular motivation for choice. In your caption, name examples of function as a deferred motivation. In your caption, name some indicators of crafting. In the spectrum between unattended to and well crafted, where do you find the range of to what degree? How does your caption weigh crafting as an aspect of choreographic choice? In your caption, considering the comparative process, can you imagine a situation where craftsmanship might be a deal breaker? Take a moment and relate craftsmanship to process and calendar.